We're going to start this next video by going back to this illustration that I showed you earlier that tells you that when you have a date type column, you have the ability to retain both a date and a time. Well, of course, as I said earlier, the majority of the time people don't want to retain a time value, they only want to keep a date. So most date type columns do not use the timestamp, which makes your life easier. For those columns that actually do use the timestamp, it does require you to do some extra work. One of those things that we've already discovered is, in order to display the timestamp, you have to use the mask, which means you have to use the to-care function and apply a mask. Well, in the next script files, we're going to see another bit of extra work that this type of a date will cause for you. I'm going to come here to the schema picture. I want to come back to the fact that we've already established in the section table we have a column called start date time, and it does keep both the date and the time, so it's using both the date stamp and the time stamp. And as I said before, when you have that scenario, it does call for you to have to work a little harder. Okay, let's come on back here then to where we left off in the script, in the schema packet. And I'm going to go to 4-1 and let me just read it. The trunc function used with dates. That's what this is about. We talked about the trunc function last chapter, and now I'm going to show you how and why you sometimes need to use it with a date type column. All date type columns contain both a date and a time stamp. The date stamp is first, followed by the time stamp. When you compare the date type column to date literals, you may need to truncate the timestamp so that when you compare, so that you will compare just a date to just a date. What I mean is you don't want the time to get in there too. You don't want to compare a date and a time to a date. So when I say just, I mean only a date to only a date. So before I go any farther with that, hold that thought. I'm going to come here and I'm going to give a command that we gave earlier. We did this at the command line earlier. Remember, if you just have a real quick command that you'd like to issue and you want to do it from the command line, you can do that. Select start date time, oops, let me spell that right, from section. And again, since I'm at the command line, I end it with a semicolon and I press enter. So you can see here, again, I know darn well there's a timestamp, but it will not display unless I use a mask. And the other thing I want to point out to you is that there are rows where the date is May 4th, 2007. And if you scan through here, I'm going to find them. I'm at least, hang on just a second, let me go through. We want to look for May 4th. Let me come back up here to the top. There's a May 3rd. Okay, there's one of them right here. You can see where I'm pointing. And there are others, but I want to confirm for you that you really do have some rows where the date is equal to May 4th, 2007. First thought. Second thought, this column really does use the timestamp, but it will not display unless you force it to do so. So that takes us here back to 4-1. Using the section table, list the course number and section IDs and start date time, but for only those courses that start on May 4, 2007. Well, I just confirmed for you that we really do have some where the date is May 4, 2007. When we run this, I want you to notice that no rows are selected, even though I just proved to you that there actually are classes that start on May 4, 2007. Before we run it though, I want to remind you again, because it's start date time, and because I do want to display the timestamp, I have no choice but to put this inside of the to-care function. The to-care function has two parameters. The first parameter is the column I want to display, which is start date time. Separate the two parameters with a comma and a space. And then here is your mask, and the most important part of this mask is that I am forcing the time to be displayed, and I'm using military time. That's what the 24 is, even though I know I don't have any evening courses, so it's kind of a wasted time to do that. But in any event, I had to use the mask so that the time would be shown. Okay, that's the first thing. And the second thing is I only want those that start on May 4, 2007. Okay. In other words, where the start date time is equal to, and you have to code it in the default date format, which we've covered that, and that is the default date format. So knowing full well, and I just momentarily ago proved to you that we really do have courses that start on May 4, 2007. Go back there and look at them again. We see them there. I am going to run this, and it's going to say there are no rows selected, meaning there are none where the start date time is equal to this value. And that's kind of frustrating because, like I said, I just showed you that there are some where the start date time does match this exact value. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and run that. Let's go to the command line, and I'm going to clear screen, and I'm going to do @4-1, and it says no rows selected. What does no rows selected mean? That means no rows met this where clause, this where condition. And again, I know I sound like a broken record. I just showed you, well, I guess I got rid of it. I showed you a moment ago that there are some courses that do start on May 4, 2007. But here is the problem, so pay attention. Start date time, as I told you a moment ago, does in fact use the timestamp. So what I have highlighted here, start date time, you have to visualize this. You have to visualize that it is using both a date and a time. It does not consist of just a date. It is a date and a time. They're connected side by side, just like this illustration shows. So when we go in, when we I'm in this where clause, do you understand that when I say start date time, it is both of them are being used? Please visualize that it's a date and a timestamp side by side, what I have shaded here. And what's happening is I'm comparing a date and a time to a date. And of course, they're never going to be equal because this has two parts to it, a date and a time. This only has a date, so they will not ever be equal. That is the problem, is when you have a column like this one, a date type column, that does use the time stamp, it causes you to do a little bit of extra work because never will a date and a time connected together ever equal just a date. So that is what 4-2 is about. If you notice, this select statement in 4.1 is identical to this select statement with this exception. Right there is the only exception. When you have a column, start date time, that uses both the date and the timestamp, and you only want it to acknowledge the date, what you need to do is say, hey, cut off that time, don't look at the time, I only want to use the date, so that you are comparing just a date, no timestamp, just a date only. You're comparing a date only to a date only. And that's what the trunc function will do. So I'm going to bring this picture back up. What the trunc function will do is it will acknowledge only the timestamp. It cuts this part of it, this half of it off just for the duration of the select. Doesn't actually go into your table and wipe out any timestamps. But for the duration of the select, it only acknowledges the date stamp and truncates off or cuts off that timestamp, which means then you're only comparing the date stamp to the date literal. So in this case, I will then compare only the date stamp to this date literal. Then you will actually make a match. So let me go to the SQL prompt, and let's do @4-2. And there you see that it did in fact make some matches, because in that case it was comparing a date to a date. So be prepared in that kind of situation that you may have to truncate off a time stamp. On that same note, I'm going to keep going with that kind of that same theme with the truncation thing, and I'm going to lead into how you can calculate, you can subtract one date from another, or add two dates together. That's where I'm going to go in this one. I'm going to ask you to go to the SQL prompt and edit, see where I live, for M like Mary. And I'm going to ask you right here where I have 2013, I'm going to ask you to change that to whatever year is next year. When you're watching this video, whatever year is next year. So I'm going to change it to a 14. And what I am saying, can I go ahead and read this? We're going to perform calculations with dates. The toDate function must be used with date literals when you're calculating. So when you're doing any kind of calculation, the toDate function must be used. And the trunc function will remove the timestamp when it calculates, when you want to subtract just dates, one date from another. Well, let's say May 5th is a very important day. Maybe it's your graduation day, maybe it's your wedding day, it's some really important day, and you want to say how many days until May 5th of next year. How many? That's why I had you change this to whatever year is next year. How many days until May 5th of next year? And this is the calculation that will happen. what we are doing, I had real briefly in an earlier video, I introduced you to this reserved word sys date, which means it will actually take the system date. It goes down into the heart of the computer where the clock keeps running and it will extract the system date. And what I am saying, can I first focus on just this? Because I want to use this date literal, May 5th, 2014, because I want to include it in a calculation, I have to do two things. I must code it in that default date format. There we go again. We keep coming back to how we have to use the default date format. I must code it in default date format and put it in single quotes. And then I have to put it inside of the toDate function so that it will be actually converted to a true date. And I only need to do that when I want to calculate with it. But what I'm basically saying is I want to take May 5th of next year and subtract from it this today's date, because the sys date is today's date. And doesn't that make sense that it will tell you how many days between May 5th of next year and today? I'm simply subtracting just like any other kind of subtraction. What you need to keep in mind though is a sys date has a timestamp. So if you use it, if you do it this way, and I'm going to just say, let's say it's about 2 o'clock in the afternoon when you run this, it's going to tell you, it's going to base it on the fact that if it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, there's about 10 hours left in today, and it's going to tell you how much of today and then how many more days after that. If you don't want to acknowledge what time of day it is, you can do the exact same calculation, only we'll truncate off the timestamp from sys date. And in that case, we will subtract a date minus a date and get a whole number, because it's just one date minus another. In this case, when the time is included, we still have a partial day left today, and so it will include the fact that there's only part of today left, and then all of the days after that. And another just review thing is, because everything I'm selecting is not included in any kind of a actual table, I had to use that dummy table called dual. Let's go ahead and run this at 4M, and it will tell you again if I'm including the time and because of what today is, I have 241 point and then there's a fraction of today left. Otherwise it will not include that.